I am Rachel Wells. 10 years in the military, I've learned how to face enemies on the battlefield. But I was never prepared for the cruelty of the man sleeping in my bed. That day, at the Ohio Military Cemetery, as the sound of the TAPS trumpet echoed to say goodbye to my father, Brian didn't stand by to hold my hand. While I was clutching the national flag draped over the casket, he approached me with a strange lawyer by his side. Without a single word of condolence, Brian threw the divorce papers at the chest of my Class A dress uniform. He shouted in front of my comrades, "Sign it, Rachel. You're as hard and cold as the scrap metal at the base. Your father is dead. His assets are the only reason I stayed for this dull funeral. Sign so I can go pick up Vanessa for dinner." He thought I was a pathetic victim. He didn't know that my father, before closing his eyes, had set up a 72-hour operation to turn this divorce into a grave to bury his greed. Let me know which state you're listening from. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that betrayal at a cemetery is an unforgivable sin. The wind at the Dayton National Cemetery carries a bite that skips the skin and goes straight for the marrow. It's an unforgiving place, a vast sea of white marble headstones standing in perfect formation, marking the final resting spots of men and women who knew the meaning of the word honor. I stood there, my back as straight as a bayonet, the heels of my spitshine jump boots clicking together as I held my position. The gray Ohio sky mirrored the steel in my heart. Today, I wasn't just Sergeant Wells, I was a daughter burying the only man who ever truly loved me. Jason Hart, a retired electrician and a veteran who smelled of ozone and peppermint, was in that casket. I focused on my breathing, a slow rhythmic cadence I'd learned in basic training. It was the only thing keeping the roar of grief from bursting out of my chest. The honor guard moved with silent, ghostly precision. They began the flag-folding ceremony, their white-gloved hands moving in a synchronized dance over the vibrant red, white, and blue. Each of the 13 folds felt like a heavy chapter of my life closing. The first fold was for the nights he spent teaching me how to wire a circuit board. The second was for the day he cried when I boarded the bus for Fort Jackson. The third was for the letters he sent to Iraq, always ending with the same line. "Keep your head down and your heart high, Rachel." I looked at the empty chair beside me. Brian wasn't there. He had promised to handle the logistics, to be my rock, to make sure the family guests were seated. Instead, the family row consisted of just me, surrounded by a wall of olive drab and blue uniforms. My brothers and sisters in arms who showed up when my own husband didn't. Then, just as the final, mournful note of taps faded into the rustling oak leaves, he appeared. Brian didn't come from the direction of the parking lot like a mourner. He stepped out from behind a large oak tree near the edge of the section, flanked by a man I recognized as Derek, a bottom-feeding divorce attorney known for his predatory tactics. Brian wasn't wearing black. He wore a navy blue slim-fit suit, looking every bit the failed real estate mogul he was, his hair perfectly gelled despite the somber occasion. He didn't even look at the casket. He didn't offer a nod to the fallen. He walked straight toward me, cutting through the formation of soldiers like they were nothing but statues. "Hey, Rachel, let's wrap up this little sob story, shall we?" His voice cut through the sacred silence like a jagged piece of glass. The soldiers around me stiffened. My commanding officer, Captain Miller, narrowed his eyes, his hand instinctively twitching toward his belt. I raised my hand slightly, a silent order for them to stand down. This was my fight. Brian reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of crisp white papers. He held them out, contrasting sharply with the folded flag I was now clutching against my medals. "I'm done, Rachel. I'm tired of being married to a walking, talking G.I. Joe. I can't stand the smell of gun oil on your skin or that ridiculous, yes, drill sergeant attitude you bring into the bedroom. It's over." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss, though loud enough for the front row to hear. "Sign these papers, now. Your old man is gone, and according to the laws of this state, I'm entitled to half of those 12 rental properties he's been hoarding. I've been stuck in this miserable marriage for years, waiting for this moment. Sign the papers so I can go take Vanessa to a real dinner. She's waiting in the car, and frankly, she's much easier on the eyes than a woman who spends her life in combat boots." I looked past him. There, idling near the cemetery gate, was my BMW, the one I had spent 3 years of combat pay to lease. Vanessa was leaning against the passenger door, reapplying her lip gloss while staring at her reflection in the window. She didn't have the decency to even look ashamed. "You're doing this here?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "At his funeral?" "Don't act all high and mighty," Brian sneered, leaning into my personal space. "You're cold, Rachel. You're a robot, just like your father was, a pathetic, lonely electrician who died in a dusty house. If you don't sign these right now, I'm filing a formal complaint with your unit. I'll tell them you're hiding marital assets. I'll make sure your precious security clearance is shredded before the sun sets." I looked down at the papers. I looked at the man I had once thought was my partner. Then I looked at my hands, the calluses, the faint scar from a shrapnel graze, the dirt under my nails from the morning's final preparations. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. It was the feeling you get right before the breach, when the world slows down and the mission is the only thing that exists. I took the pen from Derek's hand. With a hand that didn't tremble even a millimeter, I scribbled my signature on the line. Brian let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. He snatched the papers back, kissed them, and tucked them into his portfolio like he'd just won the lottery. "Good girl, see? I knew you'd be reasonable. Have fun with your memories and your scrap metal, Sergeant. I've got a life to start." He turned on his heel and walked away, his laughter echoing against the silent graves. As he walked away, Sergeant Miller, my father's oldest friend and fellow veteran, stepped forward from the shadows. He didn't offer me a tissue. He didn't offer a hug. Instead, he pressed a small weathered envelope into my palm. "Rachel," Miller whispered, his voice gravelly and firm. "Your father told me to give you this the moment he signed those papers. He said to tell you, the 72-hour clock is ticking. Meet me at Pete's Diner in 20 minutes. It's time to show that parasite what happens when you declare war on a heart." A cold electric shiver ran down my spine. The pain didn't vanish, but it suddenly had a purpose. Brian thought he had just won my father's legacy. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant. The bell above the door at Pete's Breakfast Corner gave a lonely jingle as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the comforting, greasy scent of industrial-strength bacon and coffee that had been sitting on the burner a little too long. I slid into the corner booth. The red vinyl was cracked and held together with duct tape, exactly where Dad always sat. Outside, the Ohio wind was still howling, but in here, the world felt frozen in time. I stared at the scarred wooden table, my fingers tracing a deep groove in the surface. I ordered a black coffee, the bottomless cup that costs $2 and tastes like battery acid. But it was what Dad drank. As the waitress poured, the steam rose up. And for a second, I wasn't in Dayton anymore. I was back in the barracks at Fort Bragg 2 winters ago. Back then, I was a fool blinded by a wedding ring. Every month, like clockwork, I'd look at my pay stub. Between my base pay and my housing allowance, I was pulling in decent money. But I never saw it. I kept exactly $200 for myself, just enough for toiletries and the occasional cheap meal. The rest, over $3,000 every single month, went straight into our joint account. I told myself I was building a future. I ate MREs, those brown plastic bags of dehydrated beef stew and crackers, just to save a few extra bucks, while Brian was back home, building his real estate empire. He'd call me at night, but he never asked how the rucksack march went or how my shins were holding up under 40 pounds of gear. No, he'd spend 40 minutes talking about the new Calvin Klein slim-fit suits he just bought. "It's an investment, Rachel," he'd say, his voice smooth as silk. I have to look the part to land the big fish. I was eating lukewarm army rations in a humid tent while he was out for steak dinners, playing the part of a high roller on my combat pay. I was nurturing a parasite, and I called it being a supportive wife. The truth didn't hit me until I came home on a surprise 4-day pass. I walked into our house expecting a quiet reunion. Instead, I found a house full of strangers and the smell of expensive bourbon. Brian was mid-laugh, holding court in the kitchen. Later that night, after the guests left, I found it in the trash. A statement for a platinum credit card I never authorized. He'd opened it in my name, using my military credentials. The balance was $8,400. When I confronted him, he didn't even flinch. He didn't apologize. He just took a long sip of his drink and smashed the glass on the hardwood floor. "You're a soldier, Rachel. You get government stipends, hazardous duty pay, free health care. You think I'm just supposed to sit here in this boring town while you're off playing hero? I'm depressed, okay? I'm stuck here while you're gone, and I deserve to live a little. You wouldn't understand because you've forgotten what it's like to be a normal person." That was his favorite weapon, gaslighting. He made my absence feel like a crime I had to pay for in cash. And then there were the insults. He hated my uniform. He hated what it represented. I remember coming home from a week-long field exercise, my face smudged with camo paint and my hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. Brian looked at me like I was something he'd stepped in. "Look at you," he'd sneered, pointing at my calloused palms. "You smell like gunpowder and sweat. It's disgusting. Why can't you be more like Vanessa? She knows how to be a woman. She's modern. She's soft. You're just a robot in a uniform." I took it. I took it all because I had sworn an oath, not just to the army, but to him. I thought grit was about enduring the pain at home the same way I endured the pain on a 12-mile march. I was wrong. Dad saw it all. He was an electrician, a man of few words and a lot of wisdom. A week before he passed, he called me to this very diner. He didn't say, "Hello." He just pushed a plate of extra crispy hash browns toward me. He noticed the purple bruise on my wrist where Brian had gripped me too hard during an argument the night before. Dad didn't yell. He just looked at me with eyes that had seen the worst of the world, and they were burning with a cold fire. "Rachel," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat, "you are a sergeant in the United States Army. You've led squads through hell. You do not let the enemy occupy your heart, not even when the enemy shares your bed." He reached into his pocket and handed me a worn, cream-colored business card. It just said, "Eleanor Hartwell, attorney at law. Keep this. You'll know when to call." I thought he was just being an overprotective, old-school father. But sitting here now, feeling the cold weight of the 72-hour deadline, I realized he wasn't just being a dad. He was being a commander. He had spent years watching Brian's greed, quietly setting up a defensive perimeter around me that Brian never saw coming. If you've ever felt like your hard work was being sucked dry by someone who didn't appreciate a single drop of your sweat, hit that like button and type "honor" in the comments. Let me know I'm not standing in this fight alone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out that same card. My father had left me a map out of the darkness. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a soldier with a fresh set of orders. I took a final gulp of the bitter coffee, stood up, and straightened my shoulders. The grief was still there, but beneath it, the steel was beginning to glow. It was time to meet Eleanor. It was time to start the clock. Marcus Chin didn't look like a high-priced private investigator. He looked like a man who had spent his life walking through the rain without an umbrella. Someone who had lost everything and was slowly, painstakingly gluing the shards of his soul back together. We sat in his battered 2005 Ford F-150, the cabin smelling faintly of stale tobacco and old upholstery. We were parked overlooking a quiet pond in Dayton Park, the ducks gliding through the water as if the world weren't crashing down around me. Marcus handed me a grainy 10-year-old photograph. It was a woman with blonde hair, laughing at a bar in Reno. It took me a second to realize I was looking at Vanessa. Her face was younger, softer, but the predatory glint in her eyes was unmistakable, even then. "She's a pro, Rachel," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp from years of hard living. Before she was Vanessa Chin, she was Sarah Miller in Nevada and Kelly Vance in Arizona. She swapped her name 3 times and taken at least 2 other men for every cent they had. She didn't choose Brian because she loved him. She chose him because he's a special kind of greedy, the kind that's easy to lead by the nose. I stared at the photo, the bile rising in my throat. But looking at Marcus, I didn't feel the usual surge of military-grade suspicion. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like a lone soldier in a foxhole. Marcus wasn't just doing this for the paycheck my father had prepaid. He was doing it because he needed a win for the good guys. He was looking for his own redemption in my battle. Later that afternoon, I drove to a quiet street on the east side, pulling up in front of a sturdy 3-story brick apartment building. It was one of the 12 properties Eleanor had mentioned. I expected a cold, industrial atmosphere, but as I stepped into the hallway, the air was warm and smelled like yeast and fresh-baked bread. A woman in her 60s named Mrs. Maria met me at the door of Unit 1A. The moment she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, and she pulled me into a hug that smelled like flower and lavender. She didn't know I was the new owner of the building. She didn't know I was a millionaire on paper. To her, I was just Jason's girl. "Your father was an angel, Rachel," she whispered, ushering me into her small but immaculate kitchen. She pushed a plate of buttery, golden brown toast toward me, real sourdough, perfectly toasted. "When my son lost his job at the plant last winter, I didn't know how we'd keep the lights on. That Friday, I found an envelope tucked under my door. Inside was my rent money for 3 months and a note from Jason. It just said, 'Pay it forward when you can. Focus on your boy.'" I took a bite of the toast, the warmth spreading through my chest, and I nearly choked. I remembered Brian. In 5 years of marriage, Brian had never made me a single meal. If I came home late from the base, he'd sit on the sofa with a scowl, complaining that I hadn't ordered Uber Eats on the way back. He treated me like a paycheck with a uniform. Here, in this humble kitchen, a stranger was feeding me with the same kindness my father had shown her. I walked through the other buildings that afternoon, meeting the people who lived in Dad's empire. I met Curtis, an older veteran in a wheelchair who lived in a modified ground floor unit. I met the Johnsons, a young couple working 3 jobs between them to give their kids a shot at college. They all called my father the commander. I realized then that the $5 million Eleanor had talked about wasn't just a number in a bank account. It was a fleet of lifeboats. Dad hadn't lived in that tiny house with the leaky faucet because he was poor. He lived like that so he could build these safe zones for people the world had forgotten. His sacrifice was a monument of grace. Brian's greed, by comparison, felt like a stain on the sidewalk. I felt a surge of sergeant-level resolve. I wouldn't let Brian turn these homes into luxury condos. I wouldn't let him kick Mrs. Maria out into the street. That evening, the neighborhood held a small potluck BBQ in the courtyard to honor Dad. It was pure Midwest. Folding chairs, paper plates, and the heavy sweet scent of hickory-smoked ribs and grilled corn on the cob. I sat in a designated honorary seat, wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't Sergeant Wells. I wasn't a victim of a cheating husband. I was just home. As the sun began to dip behind the Ohio skyline, a little girl with pigtails ran up to me. She handed me a single bright yellow wildflower she'd picked from the edge of the parking lot. "This is for you," she chirped. "Thank you for being Mr. Jason's daughter." The ice around my heart finally shattered. I thought about what Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Brian thought he was taking a house and some money. He didn't realize he was trying to steal a sanctuary. I looked at the people around me, this second family built on gratitude rather than blood. Brian could take my last name, but he could never take this. These people gave me something Brian never could. A reason to fight that was bigger than myself. I gripped the wildflower and looked at Marcus, who was leaning against his Ford at the edge of the crowd. He nodded once, a silent confirmation. The 72-hour clock was still ticking, but the fear was gone. I was a heart, and I was home. And God help anyone who tried to take that away. The office of Eleanor Hartwell was tucked away in a weathered, red brick building in downtown Dayton, a place that breathed the history of a city built on grit and industry. I climbed the creaking mahogany stairs, my hand still clutching the business card Dad had given me. When I stepped inside, the air smelled of old parchment and expensive tobacco. Eleanor sat behind a massive oak desk, a woman in her late 70s with white hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes as sharp as a desert hawk's. She didn't offer a hug or a platitude. She just pushed a thick, black leather-bound folder across the desk. "Welcome, Sergeant Wells," she said, her voice a resonant alto that commanded respect. Your father, Jason, has been paying my retainer for 10 years just to prepare for this exact day. He knew Brian was a snake, and he spent a decade waiting for that snake to show its fangs. I opened the folder, and for a moment, the world stopped spinning. I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from sliding off the chair. My father, the man who spent 40 years crawling through attics and fixing faulty wiring, the man who lived in a house with peeling paint and drove a rusted-out truck, was a millionaire. He owned 12 commercial and residential properties across the Montgomery County area. The bottom line on the summary sheet was staggering: $5,200,000. Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze intensifying. Jason was a genius of the blue-collar world, Rachel. He bought distressed properties, fixed them himself, and provided affordable housing for the people this city tried to toss aside. But here is the most important part. Exactly 72 hours before he passed, he called me. He had a premonition. He signed a final order moving every single asset into an irrevocable trust in your name only. She allowed a cold, thin smile to touch her lips. Under Ohio law, assets in this specific type of trust are not considered marital property. Brian lost the right to a single cent of this legacy the second your father signed that paper. He was defeated before he even had the chance to throw those divorce papers at you at the cemetery. A surge of electricity, cold and powerful, raced down my spine. Dad hadn't just left me money, he had built a fortress around my future. But then, the door opened and a man I recognized as Marcus Chin, the investigator I had just met briefly, stepped in. He carried a tablet and a look of grim determination. "Sergeant, there's something else you need to see," Marcus said. He tapped the screen and slid the tablet toward me. "I pulled the cloud footage from the hidden security cameras your father installed in his living room last month. This was recorded the night he had the heart attack." I watched the screen, my breath hitching in my throat. I saw my father, clutching his chest, collapsing into his favorite recliner. Then, the front door opened. Brian and Vanessa walked in. They didn't call 911. They didn't rush to his side. Instead, while my father was gasping for air, struggling to reach his phone, Brian began tearing through the drawers of the roll-top desk. "Where is it, you old bastard?" I heard Brian's muffled shout on the recording. He stood over my dying father, his face twisted with a greed so dark it made me sick. "Tell me where the deed to the apartment buildings is, or I'll make sure Rachel gets kicked out of the army for your debts." Vanessa stood in the background, coolly checking her reflection in a hallway mirror while Dad's hand fell limp. They stayed there for 20 minutes, searching for a will that didn't exist, before finally walking out and leaving him to die in the dark. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed at the cemetery. Something inside me snapped into place, a cold, tactical precision I had used during my tours in Iraq. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a war against monsters who had murdered the soul of my family. I remembered the dog tag I kept in my pocket, engraved with Dad's favorite verse, Psalm 27:1. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" I stood up, adjusting the collar of my uniform, my movements crisp and deliberate. Eleanor looked at me, recognizing the shift in my posture. "What's the plan, Rachel?" "In the army, when we're ambushed, we don't retreat. We counterattack," I said, my voice as hard as the steel of a rifle barrel. I pulled out my phone and composed a text to Brian. "I've looked at the papers. I'm ready to settle the property division. Meet me at Eleanor Hartwell's office on Monday morning at 9. Bring Vanessa. She'll want to be there for this." I hit send. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed with a smug, laughing emoji from Brian. He thought he had me cornered. He thought I was surrendering to save my career. "Let him enjoy his weekend," I whispered, looking at the tablet one last time. "Operation Dawn officially begins now. By Monday afternoon, Brian and Vanessa won't just be out of my life. They'll be wishing they never stepped foot in Ohio." I walked out of the office, the weight of the $5 million feeling like a loaded weapon in my hand. I had the intelligence, I had the legal high ground, and most importantly, I had the spirit of a heart behind me. Brian thought he was the hunter. He had no idea he was already walking into the kill zone. It was 11 p.m. p.m. The barracks were blanketed in an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of the industrial HVAC system and the distant, rhythmic footsteps of the night watch. I was sitting on the edge of my bunk, staring at my father's dog tags, when my phone vibrated. The screen illuminated the dark room with a name that made my stomach churn. Brian. I picked up on the third ring. I didn't say a word. Listen to me carefully, Rachel. Brian's voice came through the receiver, thick and slurred with the unmistakable scent of cheap bourbon. He wasn't hiding behind his fake realtor persona anymore. The mask had slipped, revealing the jagged edge of a desperate man. I know about the properties. I know about the 12 buildings and the $5 million that old bastard was hiding. Don't think for a second you're keeping it all for yourself. Vanessa spent the whole evening digging through tax records and public filings. We see the trail. That money is in a trust, Brian, I said, my voice as cold as the floor joists in an Ohio winter. It was never yours. It's marital property, you stubborn bitch, he snarled, and I could hear the clink of ice against glass on his end. And here's how this is going to go. If you don't sign over at least 6 of those buildings to me by Friday, I'm sending a formal report to your commanding officer. I've already drafted the letter. It details how you've been using your military housing allowance and government stipends to fund an illegal real estate side hustle without disclosing it. You know exactly what that does to your top secret security clearance. You'll be stripped of your rank, processed for a general discharge, and kicked out onto the street before you can say, at ease. How does it feel to think about being a homeless veteran, Rachel? Because that's where you're headed. Before I could respond, the phone was snatched away. Vanessa's voice came on, smooth and poisonous, like velvet-wrapped razor wire. Hello, Sergeant Wells. I hear you've been hiring people to look into my past. Don't waste your breath. I'm pregnant with Brian's child. In the eyes of an Ohio court, I'm a vulnerable mother-to-be, and you're just an aggressive, lonely soldier with a gun and a chip on her shoulder. Who do you think the judge is going to believe? The expectant mother or the cold robot who didn't even cry at her own father's funeral? Sign the deeds, or I'll make sure you spend the next 5 years in a federal cell for financial fraud. I heard Brian's muffled, cruel laughter in the background. They were hitting my blind side, targeting the 2 things I had sacrificed everything for: my career and my desire for a family. My heart was hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing steady. I hung up without giving them the satisfaction of a plea. The next morning, the nightmare took shape. At 08 Maui, I was summoned to the headquarters building. Walking down those sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways felt like marching toward a gallows. When I entered the office, Captain Miller didn't look at me. He was staring at a printed email on his desk, an anonymous tip, detailed and vicious. Sergeant Wells, he began, his voice heavy with disappointment. I've received a serious allegation regarding your financial conduct and undisclosed assets. 10 years of exemplary service, Rachel. Medals for valor, a spotless jacket. And now this? Until the JAG officers and the security office complete their review, your clearance is suspended. You are restricted to the base. If these allegations are true, your career is over. I stood at attention, my thumbs lined up with the seams of my trousers, staring at a point on the wall behind him. The shame was a physical weight, a burning heat in my throat. Brian didn't just want the money. He wanted to strip me of my identity. He wanted to see me crawl. I walked out of the HQ building an hour later, my hands clenched so tight that my fingernails drew blood from my palms. I felt the eyes of my peers on me. The whispers had already started. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I knew the rules of engagement. In the Army, we have a saying: never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. I typed a short message to Brian. I can't lose my clearance, it's all I have. Monday morning, 09. At Eleanor's office. I'll bring the transfer deeds. Just please, don't send anything else to my CO. His reply came back within seconds, a simple thumbs-up emoji followed by, smart girl, see you Monday, Sergeant. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. A cold, lethal calm settled over me, the kind of stillness that comes before a sniper pulls the trigger. Brian thought he had broken me. He thought the lonely soldier had finally surrendered. He didn't realize that by threatening my honor, he had authorized me to use every weapon in my arsenal. The 72-hour clock was still ticking, and the trap was finally set. I was standing in the middle of the Walmart parking lot on a muggy Saturday morning, the kind of place where half of Dayton comes to stock up on cheap coffee and motor oil. I had just finished loading a few crates of water into the bed of my father's rusted 1998 Ford F-150. My decoy text from the night before had worked perfectly. Brian and Vanessa were so blinded by their own greed that they couldn't wait until Monday. They wanted to corner me while they thought I was weak, still reeling from the sudden investigation at the base. The screech of tires announced their arrival. Brian's silver BMW, the one my combat pay was still paying for, slid into the space behind my truck, effectively blocking me in. Brian stepped out, looking smug in his designer sunglasses, followed by Vanessa, who was wearing a tight floral dress that barely hid her fake silicone baby bump. Brian walked right up to the front of Dad's truck and slammed his hand down on the hood. The sound of metal on metal echoed across the asphalt. "Look at this piece of junk, Rachel," he barked, loud enough to draw the attention of a group of veterans wearing VFW hats nearby. "This rust bucket is a perfect metaphor for your old man. Outdated, smelly, and falling apart at the seams. You really think you're going to use this trash heap to haul $5 million worth of real estate? It belongs in a junkyard, just like Jason's memory." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting on the tailgate. I was in my Class A uniform, having just come from a morning briefing where I had to defend my honor against his lies. I felt the heat of the sun on the brass buttons of my jacket, but my blood was running ice cold. Vanessa stepped up beside him, crossing her arms over her chest with a wicked grin. "Just sign the deeds, Sergeant. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I've already got a reporter from the local news on speed dial. How's it going to look when the headline reads, 'Local war hero abuses unemployed husband and unborn child'? Your career is a glass house, Rachel, and I've got a very heavy stone." I didn't blink. I didn't move. Brian took my silence for surrender. He stepped into my personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee and arrogance. He looked down at my spit-shined jump boots, then slowly, deliberately, he gathered his spit and hurled it onto the pavement right next to my toe. "This uniform," he sneered, gesturing at my medals and my sergeant's stripes. "You think you're a hero because you wear this costume? You're just a puppet for the government, a robot. And your father? He was a pathetic, low-rent electrician who died with nothing but a pile of bricks because he was too stupid to enjoy his life. He was a failure, and you're just following in his footsteps." The mention of my father being a failure was the spark hitting the powder keg. 10 years of military discipline held my hands steady. But the Rachel who had loved this man died right there on that asphalt. This wasn't a divorce anymore. This was a tactical elimination. "That's enough," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the resonance of a closing cell door. Brian blinked, his smirk faltering for a split second. "What did you say?" I stepped forward, closing the gap until our chests almost touched. I was taller than him, and in my boots, I towered over his insecurity. "You can insult me all you want, Brian. I've been yelled at by bigger men than you since I was 18. But you just committed a fatal error. You touched my father's name, and you insulted this uniform." I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my smartphone, the screen glowing. I showed him the active recording app. "I've been recording since the moment your tires screeched. Every threat, every mention of the properties, and every word of your extortion attempt is right here. And because we're in public, in a one-party consent state like Ohio, it's all admissible." Vanessa's face went pale. The expectant mother act vanished as she lunged forward to grab the phone. "Give me that!" I didn't even have to try. I pivoted on my heel, a standard defensive maneuver, and gave her a firm, one-handed shove. It sent her stumbling back until she crashed into a line of abandoned shopping carts with a loud metallic clatter. People started pulling out their own phones, filming the scene. I looked Brian dead in the eye. For the first time, I saw the flicker of genuine fear in his pupils. You want a financial war? Fine. But you forgot one thing. I'm a logistics sergeant. I know exactly how to cut off an enemy supply chain. If you have ever had a person in your life who mistook your silence for weakness and tried to tear down everything you worked for, hit that like button right now. Type "stand tall" in the comments to show Brian and Vanessa that they picked the wrong soldier to mess with. I didn't wait for a reply. I hopped into the cab of Dad's Ford and turned the key. The engine roared to life with a fierce, guttural rumble that drowned out Brian's frantic shouting. I backed out, forcing him to scramble out of the way, and drove toward the exit without looking back. I picked up my hands-free headset and dialed Eleanor. It's Rachel. Initiate Phase 2. I don't just want them broke, Eleanor. I want them buried under the weight of their own greed. I want every shred of their dignity gone by Monday morning. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw Brian standing alone in the parking lot. He thought he was the hunter. He had no idea I was about to dismantle his world, brick by brick. By Sunday morning, Eleanor Hartwell's office in downtown Dayton had been transformed into a tactical command center. The mahogany desk was buried under layers of bank statements, property deeds, and high-resolution surveillance photos. Maps of the 12 properties were pinned to the walls like target zones. I stood by the window, watching the rain blur the Ohio skyline, feeling a cold, professional focus settling over me. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was a soldier finalizing a mission brief. Marcus Chin walked in, tossing a thin manila folder onto the center of the table. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from a red-eye flight back from the West Coast, but he had a grim smile on his face. I found it, Rachel, Marcus said, his voice like gravel grinding together. I tracked her back to a small surgical center in Reno, Nevada. 5 years ago, after she pulled a similar stunt on a developer in Vegas, Vanessa had a 2-ball ligation. She's been medically sterile for half a decade. There is no baby. That bump she's been flaunting is a high-end medical-grade silicone prosthetic. She's been playing on your humanity to buy time for the heist. A wave of pure, visceral disgust washed over me. I've seen some terrible things in the service, but the idea of a woman using the sanctity of a child, a life that didn't even exist, as a weapon for extortion made my skin crawl. They weren't just trying to take my money, they were mocking the very concept of family. It gets worse, Eleanor added, sliding a stack of notarized loan applications toward me. While you were deployed, Brian used your power of attorney and your military-grade credit score to take out a series of predatory bridge loans totaling $200,000. He told the lenders it was for property renovations, but the money was funneled directly into a shell company controlled by Vanessa. Marcus traced the digital trail. They were planning to wire the entire sum to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands the moment you signed those transfer deeds on Monday morning. I looked at the numbers on the page. $200,000 of debt tied to my name, while Brian was using my combat pay to buy Vanessa's loyalty and her plastic surgeries. It was a calculated financial assassination. Every penny I had earned while dodging IEDs was being used to build my own coffin. They didn't just want to leave you, Rachel, Eleanor whispered. They wanted to leave you bankrupt, dishonored, and buried in litigation while they vanished into the sunset with your father's life work. Just then, the heavy oak door opened, and a woman with silver hair and a sharp, charcoal gray suit stepped in. I recognized her immediately from the photos on Dad's mantle. Amanda Pierce, a former federal prosecutor and one of my father's oldest friends from the neighborhood. She looked at me with a profound sense of respect, her eyes softening for only a second before turning back to steel. Sergeant Wells, Amanda said, her voice carrying the weight of the U.S. Department of Justice. Your father reached out to me months ago. He was worried, not just about the money, but about the criminal element Brian had brought into your home. We have seen enough. Between the identity theft, the wire fraud, and the conspiracy to commit grand larceny, this is no longer a civil divorce matter. This is a federal criminal investigation. I stood a little straighter. What do we do now, Amanda? We let them walk into the trap, she replied. We need them to walk into that room tomorrow and verbally confirm their demands. We need them to lie on the record one last time. I'll have a team from the Dayton police and a couple of federal agents in the observation room. I want you to be the one to drop the hammer, Rachel. You deserve that much. I nodded slowly. It felt like I was cleaning my service rifle before a major engagement. The movements were familiar, the purpose was clear, and there was absolutely no room for error. That night, I returned to my empty house for the last time. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a cold shell. I went to the basement and pulled out an old, dented tin box Dad had kept hidden in the rafters. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a photograph of my parents on their wedding day in 1975. Dad looked so young, his tuxedo slightly too big for his frame, and Mom was radiant in a simple lace dress. They had built a life on hard work, honesty, and a rusted-out Ford truck. They had protected each other. Now, it was my turn to protect what they had left behind. I knelt by the side of my bed, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I opened my Bible to the passage Dad had marked with a faded bookmark, Psalm 37:12-13. The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. I didn't pray for vengeance. I prayed for the strength to be the daughter my father raised. I turned off the light and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The 72-hour clock was down to its final hours. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and it would be the last day Brian Wells ever thought he could outsmart a soldier. The air conditioning in Eleanor Hartwell's office hummed with a clinical, biting chill that suited the atmosphere perfectly. On the conference table sat two half-empty Starbucks lattes that Vanessa and Brian had brought in, their cloying, artificial pumpkin spice scent competing with the smell of old law books. Brian leaned back in the leather chair, his feet, shod in Italian loafers, planted firmly on the edge of Eleanor's mahogany table. He was wearing a slate-gray Armani suit that I had paid for out of my re-enlistment bonus. Vanessa sat beside him, her hand resting protectively over her floral print maternity dress, her eyes glued to the latest iPhone. "Morning, Rachel," Brian said, his voice dripping with a smug, oily satisfaction. "I've got to say, you look remarkably calm for a woman whose career is about to go up in flames. But hey, I'm a nice guy. I've got the settlement right here. You sign over 50% of those 12 properties, and Derek here will call off the hounds at the Inspector General's office. Don't let Vanessa's baby grow up with a mother who's a broke, dishonored civilian. Let's just wrap this up so we can get to our lunch reservation at the Oakwood Club." Derek, his hyena-like lawyer, nodded with a thin, predatory grin. "My client is being exceptionally generous, Sergeant Wells. It would be a shame to see 10 years of service erased by a stubborn refusal to share marital assets." Eleanor Hartwell didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her black coffee, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a single, bright green folder. She slid it into the center of the table like a card player revealing a winning hand. "Actually, Derek," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel, "you and your client seem to have missed a very specific detail in the Ohio Revised Code. Exactly 72 hours before he passed, Jason Hart established an irrevocable trust. He transferred all 12 properties and the $5 million in liquid assets associated with them into that trust for the sole benefit of his daughter, Rachel. Under Ohio law, because this was a premeditated gift from a third party and finalized before the divorce filing, these assets are not and will never be marital property. Brian, you aren't entitled to a single brick. In fact, based on the forensic audit Marcus Chin conducted, you actually owe Rachel $200,000 for the fraudulent loans you took out in her name." The color drained from Brian's face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He stammered, his feet slipping off the table with a dull thud. That's impossible. He was a low-rent electrician. He didn't have that kind of money. I'm the husband. I have rights." Vanessa's eyes darted toward the door. Suddenly she let out a sharp gasp, clutching her stomach. Oh, Brian, I think the stress is too much. The baby. I need to go to the hospital. Now." She began to stand up, her face twisted in a calculated mask of agony. I moved before she could take a single step. I didn't yell. I didn't draw a weapon. I simply stepped in front of the door, my posture perfect, my eyes fixed on her. "Sit down, Sarah," I said. She froze. My name is Vanessa. Not in Reno, Nevada, it isn't, I countered. I picked up the medical file Marcus had provided and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the wood and hit Brian's Starbucks cup, knocking it over. That belly is a silicone prosthetic, Brian. Vanessa, or Sarah Miller, as she was known when she pulled this same scam in 2018, had a tubal ligation 5 years ago. She can't have children. You've been paying for her designer dresses and her fillers with my combat pay while she lied to your face about a kid that doesn't exist. Brian looked at the file, then slowly turned his head toward Vanessa. He reached out and poked her stomach. The dress didn't yield like flesh. It resisted like rubber. The look of utter, soul-crushing humiliation on his face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He had been betrayed by the very person he had betrayed me for. You lied to me? Brian whispered, his voice cracking. Before she could answer, the door behind me opened. Amanda Pierce stepped in, flanked by 2 detectives from the Dayton Police Department and a federal agent in a dark windbreaker. Brian Wells, Sarah Miller, also known as Vanessa Chin, Amanda said, her voice echoing with the authority of the law. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and federal extortion. You have the right to remain silent. Brian collapsed back into his chair, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate pleading as the handcuffs ratcheted shut over his wrists. Rachel, please, tell them. She made me do it. She said we'd be rich. You can't let them take me. I looked at him, and I thought of my father's quiet house. I thought of the way he had died alone while this man searched for a checkbook. I thought of the verse in John. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I'm already free, Brian, I said, my voice cold and final. You chose the wrong side at the cemetery. A soldier never shows mercy to a traitor. As the police led them out, the hallway was filled with the sudden, sharp wail of a siren from the street below. I turned to the window and watched them being loaded into the back of a cruiser. The weight of the last 3 days didn't just lift, it evaporated. I took a deep breath of the cold office air, and for the first time in years, it tasted like justice. The interrogation room at the Montgomery County Jail was a box of cinder blocks and fluorescent humming, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale anxiety. I stood in the darkened observation gallery, separated from the suspects by a thick pane of one-way glass. I wasn't there to testify. I was there to witness the final disintegration of the 2 people who had tried to bury me alive. It didn't take long for the vows they had shared to turn into poison. In room 1, Brian was a weeping, pathetic mess. He wasn't the slick realtor anymore. He was a terrified coward in a paper-thin orange jumpsuit. He was leaning across the table toward the detective, his voice high and frantic. It was all her, Vanessa, or Sarah, whatever her name is. She was the mastermind. Brian shrieked, his face blotchy with tears. I didn't want to hurt Jason, but she told me that if he died sooner, we wouldn't have to wait for the properties. She's the one who grabbed his nitro pills from the nightstand and hid them in the kitchen when he started clutching his chest. She told me to just keep searching the desk. I was just following her lead. Please, you have to tell Rachel I'm sorry. I was under a spell. I watched him through the glass, my heart as cold as a stone in a creek. He was willing to hand over his lover for a lighter sentence before the ink was even dry on his booking sheet. In the next room over, Vanessa was just as ruthless. She sat with her back straight, her fake pregnancy gone, her eyes hard and calculating. She was already naming every offshore account Brian had tried to hide, every military document he had forged, and every lie he had told to the bank. The passionate love they had displayed at the cemetery had been a business arrangement, and now that the company was bankrupt, they were tearing each other apart like starving hyenas over a scrap of bone. Brian requested to see me before he was processed for transfer. Amanda Pierce advised against it, but I needed to close this door personally. I walked into the visitor's booth, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind me. Brian sat behind the glass, looking small and withered. He had lost 10 pounds in 48 hours. Rachel, he gasped, pressing his palm against the glass. Thank God. Listen, I can make this right. When I get out, we can move to Florida. I'll work. I'll do anything. I know I messed up, but we're still family, right? You've always been the strong one. Please, talk to the prosecutor. Tell them I'm a victim too. I looked at him through the glass, my expression as flat as a desert horizon. I didn't see a husband. I didn't even see an enemy. I saw a ghost. Brian, I said, my voice steady and quiet, sounding like a formal military report. The boundary between us wasn't drawn with a pen. It was drawn with the blood of my father and the tears I shed while you were laughing at his grave. You don't owe me an apology. You owe the law a debt, and you're going to pay it in full. Don't ever say my name again. To you, Sergeant Rachel Wells doesn't exist. I stood up and walked out, leaving his desperate, muffled screams echoing against the steel walls. I didn't look back. I drove back to my father's house, the house I was now the sole owner of. I didn't go inside to sleep. I went there to cleanse. I spent the next 6 hours dragging every single item Brian had ever touched out onto the gravel driveway. The Armani suits, the Italian loafers, the expensive watches he'd bought with my combat pay, and the glossy real estate magazines. I piled them into the rusted metal burn barrel in the backyard. I struck a match and watched the flames take hold. The scent of burning wool and expensive leather filled the night air, a dark smoke rising toward the Ohio stars. It felt like a baptism. As the fire roared, I felt the layers of his manipulation peeling away from my soul. I was no longer the robot he had insulted. I was a woman reclaiming her territory. While clearing out the guest room, I moved the heavy oak dresser and found something wedged against the baseboard. It was Dad's old, weathered leather wallet. Inside, tucked behind his expired driver's license, was a small, tattered photograph I had never seen. It was me at age 6, wearing a plastic soldier's helmet and a camo vest Dad had bought me for Halloween. I was saluting the camera with a gap-toothed grin. On the back, in his shaky handwriting, he had written, "My little sergeant. Protect the things that matter." The tears finally came then, not of pain, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. Dad had been protecting me since I was 6 years old, and he was still doing it from the other side. The next morning, Marcus Chin met me at Pete's Diner. He handed me the final report. Vanessa was looking at 12 years for federal fraud and identity theft. Brian, for his cooperation and lesser involvement in the actual identity theft, was looking at 2 years in a state facility. But the judge had already revoked his real estate license for life. He would never sell another square inch of dirt in the state of Ohio. "What now, Rachel?" Marcus asked, stirring his coffee. I looked at the folder Eleanor had given me, detailing the $5 million in the trust. I thought about the women Vanessa had scammed before me. I thought about the families in Dad's buildings. "I can't change what Brian did," I said, looking out at the morning sun. "But I can use what my father left me to make sure no other woman in this town has to sit in a lawyer's office and feel as alone as I did. I'm going to turn this legacy into a shield." That night, for the first time in years, I slept without a single dream. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer just a soldier. I was a heart. And I was finally free. 6 months have passed since the doors of the Montgomery County Jail slammed shut on Brian and Vanessa. This morning, I found myself standing on the 3rd-floor balcony of a renovated brick apartment building in the heart of Dayton. The air didn't smell like gunpowder, ozone, or the bitter tang of adrenaline anymore. It smelled of fresh, high-altitude Ohio air, top-shelf hazelnut coffee, and the sweet, distant scent of blooming marigolds from the window boxes below. From this height, I could hear the rhythmic thud of a basketball in the courtyard and the bright, unfiltered laughter of children playing on the new jungle gym. I had spent the last half-year poured into these 12 properties. I didn't sell them for a quick profit or turn them into glass and steel luxury condos that no one in this neighborhood could afford. Instead, I officially established the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation. These buildings were no longer just real estate assets. They were sanctuaries. We converted several units into emergency housing for women who, like me, had been victims of financial abuse and predatory partners. We provided them with a safe roof, vocational training, and the kind of top-tier legal protection Eleanor Hartwell had given me. Looking at the sturdy brickwork, I didn't see cold construction. I saw my father's rough, calloused hands reaching out from the past to embrace this community. He didn't just leave me a fortune, he left me a duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. I am still a sergeant in the United States Army. Every morning, the alarm clock shrieks at 05. And I'm out on the pavement, my boots hitting the asphalt in a steady, grounding cadence. But my reasons for running have changed. I no longer run to outpace the ghosts of a failing marriage or the shame of being too cold for a man who didn't deserve my warmth. I run because I am a protector. I run because I have a legacy to defend. Marcus Chin is now the executive director of the foundation. He still drives that battered Ford truck, and his voice still sounds like he's been eating gravel for breakfast. But there's a new light in his eyes. Together, we've used Dad's trust fund to hire a small team of investigators. We are hunting other financial predators, the Sarah Millers of the world, who think they can bleed honest people dry and disappear. I realized that my rank of sergeant wasn't just earned on the battlefield of Iraq. It was a lifelong commission. I spend my weekends teaching financial literacy classes to young military families at the base, making sure no young soldier ever has to eat MREs in a tent while someone else drains their bank account. This afternoon, I returned to the Dayton National Cemetery. The Ohio sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, and the sun cast long golden shadows across the rows of white marble. The gray gloom of that funeral day felt like a different lifetime. I walked to the spot where my parents rested together. I placed a single, perfect white rose on my mother's side of the headstone. For my father, I did something a little different. I pulled a small vintage crescent wrench from my pocket, the one he had used to teach me my first circuit, and leaned it against the base of the marble. I stood at the foot of their grave, straightened my uniform, and snapped the sharpest, longest salute of my entire career. "Mission report, Dad," I whispered, my voice thick but steady. "The perimeter is secure. The survivors have been rescued. The enemy has been neutralized, and the hearts are still standing." A sudden gentle breeze rustled the nearby oak leaves, brushing against my shoulder like a heavy, proud hand. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and for the first time in 10 years, the armor around my heart didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a shield. I took one last look at the white headstones, exhaled a decade's worth of tension, and walked back to Dad's truck. As I climbed into the cab and felt the familiar vibration of the engine, I looked at the dog tags hanging from the rearview mirror. I thought of the verse from Isaiah 61:3 that Eleanor had read to me, "To give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning." I turned the camera toward me, speaking softly but with the strength of a woman who has been through the fire and come out as tempered steel. If you are listening to this right now and you feel betrayed, humiliated, or broken by the people you trusted most, listen to me carefully. You are a warrior. Your scars are not signs of your weakness. They are your medals for survival. Do not let anyone define your worth by your bank account or your submission. Stand up, draw your line in the sand, and create your own dawn. I am Rachel Wells, and this is the war I won. What about you? I shifted the old Ford into gear and let the clutch out. The truck rolled toward the horizon, the golden light of the afternoon stretching out before me, long and promising. The 72-hour clock had stopped long ago, but my time was just beginning. The most expensive lesson I learned wasn't found in a military manual. It was written in the scars of betrayal. I realized that your worth is never a negotiation, and you should never apologize for the boundaries you set to protect your peace. Loyalty is a precious gift that must be earned, not a debt you owe to people who only see you as a resource to be exploited. When life strips everything away, it doesn't leave you empty. It reveals the unbreakable steel of your character. Turn your pain into a shield for others, because real wealth isn't in your bank account. It's in the honor you keep and the lives you lift. I want to thank you for walking this long, hard path with me today. My story is just one of many, and I know there are warriors among you fighting your own silent battles right now. Does my journey resonate with what you've been through? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me where you're listening from and share what standing tall means to you in the comments below. If you believe in justice and the power of the human spirit, Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience and hope. Stay strong, keep your head high, and I'll see you in the next mission.